Hey guys, this is Eads from the Rookie Project, and in this tutorial I'm going to go over the creation from start to finish of this tree stump. What's going to be covered in this tutorial will be modeling. We'll go into sculpting a little bit, texture baking, simple texture creation in GIMP, and then that's about it. So this is a stump that I made earlier, and we're going to try to get something similar to this with this tutorial. So I'm going to go ahead and start up a new blend file, maybe close a couple of these things. Okay, delete those because we're not going to use them, and I'm going to get rid of the grid floor. Alright, tap into edit mode, take this cube, delete it, and replace it with a mesh circle. Shift A to add a mesh. Change it to 12 vertices because we want to try to get a low poly model for our game, for performance of course. And just leave it as a empty ring. Now we're going to extrude upwards. This is our trunk. Select everything, hit Control N, because this actually did a good job, but sometimes when you extrude empty circles they will tend to give you issues with the face normals. Okay, so now we're gonna set up our sort of roots at the bottom, so I'm just gonna grab a couple of random vertices and just drag them up so that we have something to extrude our roots from. So just go around here and get a couple of these. That looks good. Next I'll select the edges that I involved in that manipulation. Just those edges. Top view, E to extrude, scale it out, Shift Z to exclude the Z axis. Just like that. Next I'll select these individually and scale them down so that they kind of taper towards the end. Okay, now we will continue to move them around until we get something that looks like the base of a tree. So I'll pull them down so that when they're on the ground, these this area right around here will be below the ground surface. And I'll go ahead and add in a plane and scale it up a little bit so that we can see where our ground will be. Now I can really just move these and know where they're going to be in relation to the ground. Alright, get these. Okay, now I'll scale in the parts, these edges that aren't involved with the roots. Scale those down a little bit so that we can get, just so they're smaller. Okay, move the whole thing down a little bit so that every part on the bottom is just a little bit below the ground surface. Next I'll add in a couple of details. I want to add more of a curving slope. That wasn't good. A sort of a curve up along there. But right now I've only got two edges, and so it doesn't look very smooth. So I'm going to select this vertex, hit Alt V, which is our rip tool. V is a regular rip tool, but when you use Alt V, it will automatically put in faces. Okay, now hit the G key twice, and that's gonna shortcut us into a vertex slide, and just slide it up around a little bit and pull this one out. I used Alt S to scale along the normals. Okay, now we got a little bit more definition around here. Right now these roots around here are connected, but I do want to add a little bit of separation between them. So I'm going to do Control Shift B, which is our bevel tool, and slide a little diamond in here, and then that's gonna hopefully give us a little bit of separation between these two roots. Okay, let's see where we're at. This is looking pretty good. I'm gonna turn on smooth shading. Looks like we got an extra edge in here when I used the rip tool. So remove doubles, and then that should be all cleared up. It's looking a little weird around here. Maybe I'll select this diamond and smooth it a couple times. I have my smooth key mapped to the Q key on my keyboard. A quick way to set up custom keyboard shortcuts is to select the tool inside the menu, right click, and then it'll say add shortcut right around here, and then you click it and you just set it to what you want. So that's what I did for the smooth tool, because I use it a lot. Probably more than I should, but whatever. Okay, so that's looking good. I'm gonna slide this down. I'm gonna use double tap the G key again to get into my vertex slide. And it's nice because it works when you don't even have vertices that are between two edge loops. Okay, then I'll extrude this upwards, scale it along the z-axis. SZ0 is going to clear any sort of z differences. Select this loop, W smooth, just to smooth it a little bit. Maybe I'll grab this one and smooth it a little bit, this one too. And then pull them back out a little bit with Alt-S. Okay. To reduce the number of polys at the top, because we're going to want to do that because we really don't need this many. I mean, you could have this many, but for the purposes of this model, I don't think we need that many. So we're going to start merging some edges together. Now I want 8 at the top, so if I have 12, that means I need to do 4 edge merges. So there's 1, 2, and 3, and 4. And that looks like 8. And it is. That's good. And I want it to be circular. Right now it's kind of lopsided because I merged a couple of edges together. I'm going to use the Loop Tools add-on, which you can enable through your user preferences. Let's see, Mesh and Loop Tools. And then I'll use the W to access the Loop Tools menu and Circle. Oof, that did not work. I don't know what went on there. I'll try that again. In vertex select mode maybe. There it went. Okay. Now we got a nice circle. Scale it around a little bit and kind of rotated it. Strangely, I'm going to rotate it along the z-axis to sort of smooth out the angles there. Alright. So now we can select these, extrude them, Alt-M to merge at center so that we have a nice flat edge. And I'm just going to merge these together. It's not very important to do that, but might as well. And this is the foundation for our tree stump. Next, we're going to set up our UV seams. So I'm going to change my view over here to my UV image editor, if I can find it. And let's start adding some seams. We can do, well, it's pretty much a cylinder, so I usually unwrap all my cylinders in a similar way, where I do one edge going up the length of the cylinder, and then do seams going around the top, but I exclude one edge like this. That way it'll unwrap it, sideways like a rectangle. This doesn't really look like a rectangle, but, and then we'll have our circle connected here on top. And this is pretty good. We wanna try to get our UV seams to be flat, or that is aligned on the x-axis. And that's because when we texture, we want our texture to wrap around the geometry, sort of go with the flow of it, I guess. And so when your UVs are aligned with the axes, then that tends to happen much better, and there's less texture manipulation that you have to do. So this is looking good. I'm gonna be done with the UVs now because we pretty much got it. Next thing I'm gonna do is do a tiny bit of sculpt detail, because it's not gonna look good if we if we try to make all our geometry, make all of that in using normal maps. So I'm going to duplicate, Shift-D, my tree stump mesh. We'll move it to the second layer, then move over. Add a modifier. We're going to add the multi-resolution modifier. But as you'll see, if we start subdividing it, it's not subdividing exactly how we want at the top. I want that to stay pretty flat. So I'm going to remove that, and then we'll make a couple of edits to our geometry. First thing I'm going to do is move this down a little bit and then extrude up. And then I'll extrude inwards. And so we have a nice guiding edge around that corner, or that edge where we want it to be sharp. And I'm just going to remove the seams. It doesn't really matter, but I don't know, I guess it kind of bugs me. So we can put our multi-resolution modifier back on, and as we start to subdivide, we can see it looks a lot better. So let's see, this will definitely do if we just have 3 subdivisions. And going into sculpt mode, the brush I'm going to use, I guess you don't have to use it, but I don't know, I guess it works kind of well for me, is the blob tool. Now you might think of the blob tool as something that you use to make, well, blobs, I guess, just like that, but you can also draw with it pretty well too. And the thing I like about it, rather than using something like the draw tool, is that I think it kind of works a little bit like the clay modifier, where it's going to fill the deeper faces in more than it will fill the faces that are that are raised. So what I'm gonna try to do is sort of paint or draw like trails of like rooty looking things up along the length of it. So I'm just using my mouse because I'm not doing like super detail, and I'm just gonna test my strength and just draw some wavy looking lines along the length here. So I'm just going around, and I'm putting a couple in at even intervals, and I'll go in between those and add a couple more. And you don't want your strokes just going like straight up. Maybe you could have a couple doing that, but you definitely don't want it going straight up. It might make it look like a pack of dynamite or something. You want them to sort of wave around, and also they don't all have to end at the top. Like you might have one that's coming in and then sort of spirals around. And I notice as I'm doing this that I will need a couple more, maybe one more subdivision. That looks a little bit better. So just drawing some organic looking shapes here. Also, you might want to sort of try to follow the geometry or the topology of the trunk. Like we can see that there's, it's kind of going around like this, and it sort of swoops up. So you try to make your strokes sort of try to follow these patterns that are in the mesh. So I'll have one coming up, and maybe one that sort of comes around like this. And this isn't super realistic because the style of the artwork that I'm going for isn't, ultra realism. But I'm just trying to add some more detail so it doesn't just, look like a flat, low poly game asset. And try to evenly distribute detail. You don't want some areas that have very large details and some areas that have lots of small detail. You want to sort of even that out. And I like to add swirling patterns, and I'm gonna go ahead and even add another subdivision, because you see a lot of swirling patterns in wood, around the knots of the wood, and they make it look a lot more interesting than just straight lines going up the length of it. So let's go in here, add a couple little lines like that. Starting to look mystical, which is good because the Rookie Project is a game about magic. Alright. Alright, well, I think that'll do for the sculpt detail. Except I might go around the edge here. It's looking a little bit sharp and weird. I'm going to use my inflate tool and inflate around the edge here. That way it doesn't look so pinched. And then I might go in with my smooth tool, set the strength down quite a bit, and also smooth along it. Alright, looking good. So back into object mode, and I'm going to transfer the sculpt detail that I did on this mesh to a normal map, which I can apply to my other mesh. But before I do that, I'm going to need to modify my original mesh so that it sort of fits the shape that I've sculpted in to my sculpt mesh a little bit better. And I'll just do that with a simple shrink wrap modifier. Because in my last trunk I did not do this at first, and I ended up with a couple of things that I didn't like in my normal maps. So the high poly object is cube 1, and I'm going to offset it a little bit, but you know what, that doesn't work. I don't know why it's looking like that. So I'll set that to 0, apply it, and then just select my whole low poly and Alt S. Pull it out a little bit, and that's looking pretty good. Alright, now we're ready to do our UVs. So go to the UV image editor, select your low poly mesh. Might even be a good idea to name them, but I'm not going to worry about that. And I'm aligning it to the x-axis a little bit better. Actually, you know what? I'm going to make it pretty diagonal. That way I can scale it up as big as possible. That way we're using as much of our UV resources as we can. And then I'll just rotate my texture and GIMP. Okay, so in the render panel, if you don't know how to texture bake, I will describe it for you. We want to bake the details in our sculpt to a normal map that will fit onto our low poly. So we need to select our sculpt mesh, right click to select the low poly. Under our bake tab, we're going to switch our bake mode. We want to bake the normals and check selected to active. So it's going to calculate, the positions on one mesh and determine what it needs to do to get the low poly mesh to look like the sculpt mode. I didn't explain that very well, but anyway. I'm going to change my margins up pretty high, maybe up to 8 or maybe 12. And that's because when 3D renders mipmap, which is to decrease the texture size as the camera gets farther away, and you have, your texture on like a black background, then you're going to start to see the seams on your UV as the texture image gets smaller. So if you increase the margin, it's going to add a buffer zone around your texture. Alright, so we need to select this low poly, give it a new image. I'm just going to call it something like that. You can call it whatever you want, of course, but alright, now that we have an image on our low poly, right click the high poly, right click the low poly, and hit bake. And it's going to take a sec, but I'll pause the video. Actually, wow, that didn't take very long at all, never mind. Sometimes it takes a minute, sometimes it takes less than 5 seconds. And you can see some of these recognizable patterns that we were drawing in our sculpt. And now, if I turn on textured solid, we will be able to see those on our low poly. It doesn't look right, of course, but we can see that it worked well. It did what we thought it, or what at least I thought it would do, which is correct. So we're good with that. Now we can F3 with your mouse in the UV image editor to save that externally or to the drive. I'll just give it the same name that I gave my texture in Blender. Alright, and you could assign a new image to your trunk to bake out the other maps that we're going to do, but I'm not going to worry about that. I'll just save them to the disk with a different file name. And I'm going to go into my World tab, because next we're going to bake ambient occlusion. But it will take the number of samples that we have under our World tab, and that's what it's going to use. So I'm going to set this a little bit higher so that we can avoid getting a grainy texture. Change over to ambient occlusion, and this time I'm also going to check normalized. And what that does is, rather than baking the ambient occlusion over the color of the texture that you have on the material of your mesh, it's just going to do a simple black and white one. So that'll give us a little bit more freedom. Also, if you didn't understand the margins that I was talking about, or what they are, if we look in at our normal map, it calculated the normals here, and once it was done, it extrapolated that outwards 12 pixels. So that's what the margin's doing. Okay, let's select again our sculpt and our low poly with ambient occlusion normalized. All the settings were preserved, so now we can hit bake. And this one I think will take a little bit longer. Alright, that finished. It only took about 20 seconds, and we have a pretty smooth looking ambient occlusion map. And we can look at it in our viewport. You notice this ridge here that looks like maybe it was a mistake, but it wasn't. It was just the shadows or the occlusion casted because the plane was because the plane is in the scene, and I'm not gonna rebake it without the plane to avoid that, because this object will be on the ground, so it will receive occlusion from the ground. So this actually is providing a more realistic effect. So I'm gonna save it out. Try not to, or I wouldn't try not to overwrite the file you saved before. Okay, I'm going to save this real quick. Probably should have done that earlier, but we'll be alright. Okay, now we are ready to go into GIMP. Alright, so we're in GIMP. This is GIMP 2.8. And we're going to open up the textures that we just baked. Wherever they are, you're going to want to open them. I'm going to... Actually, we just need to open the ambient occlusion math. Okay, now we're going to open as layers. Don't do open or you'll get a new image window. And we're going to open up our color texture, which is placed in my downloads folder. I know, real organized, huh? And this is a texture from cgtextures.com. It is a free texture website, if you haven't heard of it, but I'm sure most of you have because it's very popular. And we can see this image is very big relative to our other image. So maybe if GIMP would let me move my layers here. Well, there seems to be some sort of bug in GIMP where, I guess maybe depending on the window size, you can't drag layers. So I'll just have to use these buttons down here. So anyway, moving on. I've got my AO layer selected. I'm going to change over to multiply so we only get the black or the dark values onto our image on the bottom. And the second thing I need to do immediately is to scale this texture down, because if we zoom out here we can see how big it is compared to the rest of our image. So Shift T to access layer scale mode, and I want to scale it down. I don't want to scale it all the way down because remember I have to rotate it a little bit to match the orientation of my UV layout. So I'll just scale it down around the size, just a little bit bigger than my actual image. Next, I'm going to turn down the opacity of it, and Shift R, rotate view. I don't know why I turned down the opacity because I still can't see behind it while I rotate, but that's okay. And the texture already sort of has a sideways run to it, so I'm not going to rotate it all the way, but let's see where that puts us. That's good, but it's still very big, because I guess just to test it, I'll go ahead and export that out and pull it into Blender so we can sort of check our scale as we go in our progress. Export, and back into Blender, let's just remap our new image to alright, it's not huge. I mean, it's big, but it's so big that it's not like super noticeably big, but we will need to scale that down. But the texture itself, there's not a whole lot more scaling that we can do on it, so we might have to do a couple more tricks. So we can pull these up, and I can sort of cut the corners on this a little bit because my UVs don't extend all the way to the corners, which allows me to scale it down more. So let's try that. Alright, And just because that looks weird, I'm gonna add a black background to my UVs, or to my image. Alright, let's see where we are. Alt R will reload the image, and that's looking a little bit better. I think that's where I will leave the scaling. Okay, another thing I want to do is, it's not mapped, it wasn't mapped totally, correctly. The ambient occlusion wasn't, so we get these these cuts on the bottom here that don't look very good. So I'm just going to blur my whole UV map. So if I hide everything else, it will switch off the multiply overlay, and that way I can see it better. And I'll blur it, Gaussian blur, maybe 8 pixels. We'll start with that, see where that gets us. Export, and whoops, forgot to put those back on. Okay, and yeah, that's good. It looks better. What I want to do now is set up my scene so that I can look at it with a hopefully a bit more flattering of a light setup. So I'll do that real quick. Okay, so I just got a simple setup here, and I'll add those lights. Go into texture mode, make sure you have GLSL shading mode enabled so that you can see it accurately. Let's add our textures. So this will be my color texture. Image or movie. Open it. Okay. UVs. Okay, that's good. Next, I'll pull in my normal map texture. Rename it. Change it to image or movie. Open. Environment trunk AO or bump. Mapping coordinates to UV. That looks okay. Make sure you check normal map so it knows how to look at the image, and then change it from color, turn that off, to geometry. And we can already see that it's having good effect. Okay, so next we'll work with our texture here a little bit more. I want to strengthen the ambient occlusion of it. So I'm going to go into my curves, and we're going to pull them down. That way we get more darks. And we're going to try to keep it on the lower end, and maybe pull up in the upper end. Change it to, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to add a layer mask to my ambient occlusion map. Set it to the grayscale of the layer so it looks exactly like our ambient occlusion map in the mask. Change the color of the RGB area of the layer to black. Select the layer mask and hit invert. So basically it's doing what it was before, but instead of multiplying over, we're overlaying it with, at an alpha value. So now when I do grain merge, we don't get light areas and dark areas, we only darken the image. And I use grain merge instead of normal because it tends to add a little bit more color to the texture as it darkens it. Overlay has a similar effect, but it doesn't do that to enough of a degree. So now when we pull it in, it should look a little more striking. So reload the image. Alright, that looks pretty good. The specularity is kind of distracting, so I'm going to switch that off. Next thing I want to do is sharpen up the texture a little bit. You don't want a dull texture, and just using, simple unsharp mask filter on it can really make quite a difference. So I'll adjust these values a little bit, and let's see what that gets us. Alright, we'll try that. It looks maybe a little too striking, but we'll just see where that gets us. And I still am not too happy about the texture size, but sharpening it up a little bit, I think that'll do. Plus, when we make it a lower resolution, having, a larger image will preserve details, but also the size of the texture won't be as noticeable. Okay, so we have sort of a problem on the top there, because of course wood in the middle of it doesn't look like that. It's got, those rings. So I'm going to go to CG textures and find one that is, suitable for that. So I'll open up my my browser here. I'll take you through this step, I guess. You can skip it if you don't want to watch it. Okay, I've gone into the wood category. I'm going to go into ends, so we can look at some pictures of wood interiors, and right off the bat I see this one and I think it's going to do. So I'll just select, I'm not going to get the biggest one, honestly, because I don't need it, because my texture right now is 1024 by 1024, and that's how big this one, the smaller one, is. And on top of that, we're just going to scale it down to this, size. So it'll do. I don't need a 3K texture for this. Okay, where did it put it? It's this one. Pull that in, and I'm just going to scale it down to start with. And pull it into place. Right about, let's see, I think that's good. You definitely don't want to make it smaller than it needs to be, which I've done. It's better to make it bigger than it needs to be and shrink it down, because you still have all of that, image information, but when you apply a scale, it removes that information, and you can't make it any bigger without, seeing noticeable scaling effects. So let's try again. That looks better. Put into place, and take the layer, add a layer mask, and set it to full opacity, or just white. Now we're going to paint on our layer mask to sort of rough away the edges. So I'll take a coarse looking brush, really anyone will do. I'm going to set on some random dynamics and apply a jitter, a small one, and make sure my brush size is not too small. And that jitter is way too much. Pull that down a little bit. Okay, now I'm just going around the outside and getting rid of all of this extra texture. I'll do it here so that hopefully we can see it a little bit better. But I just want to get right around that sort of octagon that you see in the ambient occlusion map. And we definitely don't want anything around the edges of the layer, because those will show up as hard seams. Especially down around here, where the rest of the wood texture is. You want to make sure you get that nice and clean. And I might even just take my rectangle, select, and start deleting full sections in that area, just around the edges. So this is sort of roughly done, but we'll go ahead and export it out, see where we're at. into Blender, reload that color texture, and yeah, I think that'll do it. Maybe I'll adjust the color of it though, because right now it seems sort of doesn't really fit with the color of the rest of the texture. So I'm going to go to Hue Saturation, turn the lightness down, saturation up a bit, and then adjust the hue. And try to maybe go something like that. Go into my curves, maybe pull them around a little bit. I got a lot of blues in here that I'm not too crazy about, so let's see if we can try to minimize those. Or instead of bringing down the blues, let's bring up the greens and reds. And I'm just sliding these curves around until I get something that, there's the blue rings are still on there, but we'll see where this is. Maybe a little more editing. It's a little oversaturated right now, I feel. Yeah. Alright, I think this will do. So, yeah, alright. One last thing, or two more things that we have to do is collect or transform this color image into a normal map that we can use so that we can add some shading effects to the actual texture, and also we're going to bake out a spec map. So the first thing I'll do is a spec map, just because it's going to be easier. So I'm gonna uncheck the ambient occlusion layer, Control Shift E. I don't want to save over my color image, and save this out to a new image that I've named spec. Open up that image we just made. Now we can start to edit it. And the reason I didn't pull in the ambient occlusion map because I don't want to use that to calculate my spec map. So I've desaturated it. Go into the curves and bring the darks up, because we want more areas that are not specular than we do that do have specularity. So I want it to be, you want it to look pretty harsh, not a lot of gray areas or areas of transition, because that'll tend to, the more contrast you have, the less dull it's going to look. So we'll try something like that. Control E, save over, and let's see where that puts us. Gonna set up a new texture. I'll just duplicate my color one and change a couple of the settings. Get a new image. Set it to UVs and uncheck color, and you'll check specularity and intensity, but you'll notice it doesn't really work. That's because we need to check RGB to intensity. And now you can see it looks much better, but it almost looks like metal now. I might turn down the or turn up the hardness, and let's get our lights in here and spin them and see what that looks like. Now I'm deciding whether or not I want to keep it looking sort of shiny metallic-y like this, because it does add sort of a cool looking effect, like a magical effect, but I think I'll leave it in there for now. It adds more interest into it, more depth, I think. So that looks good. You can turn this back down on your map if, however you like it, but I'm going to leave mine like this. And the next thing I'm going to do is create a normal map of my color texture. So I'll go back into GIMP, select my color texture that I edited, again, Control Shift E and add it and save it out under a different file name. And now I'm gonna switch to Photoshop just because there's an add-on that I downloaded that creates good normal maps, but of course you don't have to use this. There are a lot of free plugins for GIMP that will do this for you well, but I like this one, and so it's the one I'm going to use. So I'm going to open up Photoshop. By the way, the add-on that I use is called Endo, or Endo, I don't know how to pronounce it. It's Endo 2. It's a plugin for Photoshop that makes good normal maps of images. Alright, so I have Photoshop opened. Honestly, I don't use Photoshop very often. I prefer GIMP. And also this plugin requires very little of Photoshop. So I'm going to find it in my start menu that you can, let's see, here it is, and now it's loading up. Uixel, Endo 2, however you say that. I just have the free trial of this, but you get it for 30 days for free, and it doesn't put any sort of watermark on your textures, so it's not really a problem if you don't pay $100 for the full edition of the program, because as far as I know, the free version does everything that the paid version does. Alright, I know that. Okay, so you just select the layer that your color image is on, and oh, there we go. That's a 3D preview of your normal map. Okay, so I'm just gonna set something simple up here. This step, you obviously don't have to follow this step by step. However you want to create your normal maps from your images is cool. This is just how I'm doing it. And it's gonna take a sec, as it does everything it needs to do. A sec, and we have this nice looking normal map. You can see it sort of raised up the interior of the tree here. I'm not sure if that's going to be a problem, but let's just see what that gives us. Hopefully we won't have to do anything about that. So, oh, here it is. It gives you a nice preview that you can wheel around. But we're done with this program, so save it out as a ping. That's a temporary file, so I'm not going to worry about naming it, because now we're going to open up this. You can do in GIMP, but I'll just do it in Photoshop just because it's already open. Just open up your original texture and file, place, pull on your other one, enter, and rasterize it. Okay, now we need to change the blend mode to overlay. So basically we're taking our two normal maps and we're combining them. And for some reason, alright, never mind. So I think I'm going to overlay the photo texture on top of the sculpt texture, just because that seems to preserve the sculpt texture better. And I'll turn it down a little bit. Okay, so Control Shift S. There. Okay. Ping. I'll just save over my original one. And back into Blender, this hopefully will look pretty good. Reload. Alright, wow. Doesn't look too bad. Definitely gives it more depth, and we can see, yeah, that looks alright. I'm liking it. Okay, well, this is pretty much our final result. Oh, we need to look at the edge here because we weren't sure about that. And the edge on the normal map looks alright. Alright. Well, one thing I'm going to do before I end this video is to scale these texture sizes down. Because right now, I mean, they're pretty big. I mean, if you zoom in real close, you can see, you know, the limits to it, but honestly, these textures are really large for something like this. Unless this was like a principal object, which it isn't. So I'll start with my normals. My normals I'm going to scale down like a lot, honestly. But so right now they're 1024 by 1024. I'm going to do 256 by 256. And you can see that difference. But my color texture I won't scale down that much. I will bring that to 512. And you can see there will be a loss in quality, but we'll be alright. That's not too bad. Next, my spec map, image, scale image, back in GIMP, switch between the two programs. Also 256 by 256. And that's the size. Control Shift E, or just Control E, I guess would have done it. Export, reload it. Yeah. Alright, now my color finally. Put this back on. Control, or image, scale image, and only 512. The color texture is bigger than the other maps just because it carries a little bit more weight as far as, you know, details go. So I can, where I could get away with a lower texture size in the bump map and spec map, I can't quite do that with the color map. And it doesn't look quite as sharp, but still good, honestly. And yep, that's the tutorial. A little under an hour here, sorry about that. But I think we have something that looks good. It's low poly, it's game ready, and yep, thanks for watching this tutorial. More tutorials to come, and I will see you next time.